we want to be very involved in the process of making government more open in New York State. And Open Book New York is a very important part of our achieving that. We issue a number of reports, and in your packets you'll see we have some examples of some of the reports that we put out there. For instance, we have a copy of Economic Trends in New York State. We do this on a periodic basis to give input on where our state is at as far as the economy. We also look at what's happening with particular communities. We put a report out in April of this year on Hispanic businesses in New York State. Very interesting statistics in terms of the growth and strength of the small business community among our Hispanic neighbors. We also focus on issues. So affordable housing, a very big issue always in New York, especially in these tough times. We looked at New York City and how the concern about affordable housing is being addressed or not being addressed. So there's a lot of useful information that we put out through these kinds of reports, and I want to make sure that you have full access to them. We obviously talk a lot these days about the state budget. We are in a very difficult fiscal time for a couple of reasons. The first is obvious. This recession has hit New York very hard. We are the global capital for finance. Wall Street is a very important part of our economy. And so much of the recession was driven by the meltdown in financial services and in the markets of a year ago. So when that sector of the economy is not being profitable and is shedding jobs, thousands of jobs, high-paying jobs, New York City, New York State is going to be hit very hard by that. Up until the downturn, financial services accounted for about 20% of the revenue coming to the state of New York, a very, very big part of our revenue base. That's changed now. We are now at about 15% of our revenue comes from financial services. So that restructuring of our economy is probably something that's going to be with us for a period of time. Is Wall Street starting to do better? Absolutely. And we put out numbers to indicate that. The return to profitability is stronger and faster than anyone had anticipated. That being said, because of those huge losses that they went through a year ago, they've earned tax credits. It's going to take a while for those to be phased out. So how much revenue we're going to get from these very recent profits, it's unclear at this point. Another source of revenue traditionally has been tax revenue from the bonus pool that is paid out usually in January following the end of the calendar year. You know that there have been many reports about the bonus pool coming back to very high levels, perhaps record levels. What's different though today, with the pressures of compensation reform and all the issues that you've been reading about, many of the financial firms are restructuring how bonuses are going to be paid. Instead of the straight cash bonus that we usually would have, it's obvious that many of the firms now instead will be doing part cash and deferred compensation, stock, other kinds of options that will not trigger the kind of tax revenue boost that we normally see. We're not sure where that's headed. We will put out a report on the bonus pool and what we think we'll be able to derive from that in terms of tax impact on the state. But it is something that's going to be a little more difficult to assess because of how compensation is being restructured. So we have the severe recession hitting us. The job loss, especially in financial services, is not going to be as dramatic as was first predicted, but you're still talking about a significant job loss in that sector of the economy. And although Wall Street is doing better, we certainly know that Main Street is not doing better, whether it's Main Street in Flushing or Main Street in Smithtown or any part of the state. We know joblessness, unemployment, those numbers continue to go up. So when people are continuing to lose their jobs, we don't have the strong personal income tax base that we had prior to this downturn. When people are still having their jobs, but they see their neighbor down the road has lost their job, going to be more conservative about spending. So sales tax revenue is impacted as well. So for the state of New York, personal income tax revenue, sales tax revenue, that's what we really depend on for most of our tax, the majority of our tax revenue. Those revenues continue to be soft and continue to fall below projections. That's why we have the pressure on the state budget. Add to it the fact that in some of the good years, New York made spending commitments that had a multi-year impact, that at the time those commitments were made, there was some question as to whether or not the revenue was going to be there. It always seemed to take care of itself because in the good years, Wall Street ended up generating profits far in excess of what was anticipated. So the problem seemed to take care of itself. You come to a year like 2008 and what we're living with in 2009, Wall Street does not save us anymore. We don't have those excess profits that we had in other years. So it's a combination of the loss of that revenue, and what's become more apparent is that New York has had a structural gap with its budget that has not been addressed. That's why we have the kind of crunch, cash flow crunch that we're facing in the month of December. New York is really at a point right now where we don't have enough money in the checkbook to pay all of the bills and obligations that are due in the month of December. I think, as you know, in response to that, the governor has taken some very strong action to try to get control of this. The legislature and the governor, a couple of weeks ago, adopted a deficit reduction plan, which partially addressed some of this difficulty, but we're not out of it yet. You should have a copy of our cash flow report and the cash report for the month of November, and that really gives you, some of the clear numbers. And as of yesterday, as you could see, we had bills that were due, and we're still getting revenue coming in. But at the end of the day, our closing balance in terms of available money was $1.6 billion. Usually, we operate with a balance of more like $4 to $5 billion. So the cash available is at a very, very tight margin. And we still have significant payments due. December is a month with big payments. We had a school aid payment of $1.6 billion. We still have a STAR payment of $2.5 billion. Medicaid payments, $400 to $500 million on a weekly basis. And December has an extra week as far as those Medicaid payments. So we are having to manage the cash. We're having to manage the checkbook for the state in a very careful way. It really is on a day-to-day basis that we're managing that. What does it mean for next year? It certainly means we're going to struggle to get through what's left of this fiscal year. The state fiscal year ends on March 31st, and we start next year with a gap of at least $8 billion. So a lot of the debate that you're seeing and you have seen in the state capitol with the state legislators today is going to continue as we move into the budget process for next year. We're not out of the woods by any means, and we won't be for a period of time. The challenge for us in New York State, we need to do a better job of aligning our recurring spending with our recurring revenues. It means we're going to have to make some smarter and no doubt tougher choices on spending if we're going to return our state to the kind of fiscal health that New Yorkers deserve. New York City, we also put out a release I think you have in your packet. The revenue picture for the city is improving. Again, because the recovery from Wall Street is happening a little faster, that's benefiting the city. The other dynamic, though, is that some of what the state is doing as far as budget cuts is going to impact on the city, particularly with regard to, programs like education, where there's been a big investment. And, that's the concern. If the state doesn't straighten out its money problems, those problems then have a way of affecting other government partners, be it New York City or the towns and villages and counties across our state or the other cities across the state, hospitals, not-for-profits that depend on state funding. So although the city is seeing some better numbers than anticipated, the job loss isn't as severe, what's happening with the state is impacting the city as well.